So she should be, did she turn on the mic? I think she did. How's the, how's the sound level? Should I go up or down, or is it just perfect? Perfect. Okay, excellent. Okay. Yeah, I think they run things more smoothly over here at Polifka than over at ACSC. Plus, my God, the big screen, and you got the TV screens here. Feel like I'm getting VIP treatment. You don't want to go over to ACSC and see Wood Auditorium. I'm just telling you. You guys are spoiled. I'm feeling spoiled up here. Well, my name is Dr. Michael Craig, and well, first of all, I teach the East Asia, I call it the East Asia Geopolitical Elective. They title it the U.S. Pivot to Asia because that sells better, I think, to students who haven't been here yet. But just so you know, I take, ever since I was a graduate student, I started looking at causes of nuclear proliferation in what used to be called the arc of instability from the Middle East to South Asia all the way up to Northeast Asia. Ever since a graduate student, I've been really focused on taking a regional approach, which marries identity, economy, internal politics and external politics, or what some people just call geopolitics. And I forgot to throw in there a fifth thing, which is geography, of course. So you have immutable geography versus more mutable politics and economics and identity. And together, you line it all up and you learn about international conflicts. Why do those conflicts exist? And why do some solutions work and not others? And through that prism, I feel like I've also learned a lot about my own country and its foibles, and that's going to be part of my talk today, is how the U.S. wants to approach things versus the region that actually exists. Now, having said that, I advertised 4 questions, or 3 or 4, and what I found when I was doing my slides yesterday, all yesterday, is that I'm going to give you the general framework, and the general framework applies all the way from Northeast Asia to Southeast, but I really only had time to focus on a couple of the geographic areas. Mainly I'm going to focus on Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Along the way, I will have some comments on South Korea as a middle power that is having increasing disputes with Japan, as I advertised in my blurb. I will not have time to fully cover South Korea-Japan dispute or Taiwan identity, though. But if you want to ask questions in that regard in the Q&A, go for it. Also, can I ask quickly, is this the only elective you guys have and then you leave, or are you going to have a second elective? This is the only one. Okay. So you're in luck. I'm covering, if I'm not covering literally everything in my blurb, I'm covering a good deal, and certainly enough to give you a base to go forward for the region. So that said, let's just get started. First of all, there's the geography of Northeast Asia and Southeast, and you'll see that I chose a map block that has Taiwan here. Taiwan's really in the middle of this arc from Southeast to Northeast Asia. You got the East China Sea, where there's a lot of disputes between Japan and China, and you got the Ryukyu Arc here with Senkaku somewhere in here, Okinawa somewhere in there. You got the West Sea, the East Sea, as the Koreans call it, or the Sea of Japan, as Japan calls it. It's a crowded geography. Just giving you short the China view, and I should say that my approach is, as my blurb indicated, my approach is to talk to you more today about possible partners and allies rather than about China. I can lecture about China at length, but my discomfort is that we're looking at a very fragmented geopolitically fragmented region, and I think we only see a third or a fourth of the story if we're just looking at China alone. But of course, you have to start with the Chinese view because that's why we're all here, right? This is the major part of great power competition that's bedeviling us. And so Beijing sees itself as doing things that are defensive. Its military and strategic writers have concluded over several decades that Japan putting Marines here and militarized coast guards, and now Japan is standing up more than ever a more militarized navy, that it's turning this into a so-called chain link fence, and that if Taiwan is not recovered, then China's development is constrained and they don't have access to the ocean. I won't go into it, but there's also huge identity issues with China internally if they don't recover Taiwan, because the party has said, we will reunify, quote unquote, all the lands taken from us by colonialism. And that's a big part of the issue, by the way, is simply, in China's view, we're not done with colonialism and a century of humiliation until we get all lands back that the Japanese or the Europeans or the Russians took. And that's why you got crises like this. This is Senkaku Islands. This is the Chinese preferred border. This is the Japanese preferred border. You get the area of dispute. And there's gas and mineral and oil resources, but it's very much about an identity dispute between Japan and China as well. And then you've got where I'm really spending the bulk of my effort today, which is the South China Sea. Or I should say I'm going to focus on ASEAN. And if you're a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN for short, if you're one of the bigger members, rather, especially in the archipelago, like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam is surrounded by sea in a majority of its territory as a large peninsula. Basically, this is what you've been facing. And I'll just quickly mention that the fracas really started in 2009. The Law of the Sea, the UN Law of the Sea, basically the global compact that governs how you view your economic rights and territory, said that within a certain set amount of time of signing on to the treaty, the global compact, you have to lay out any claims that may be disputed with someone else. And Vietnam and Malaysia, I think Indonesia as well, did just that in 2009. They met the deadline of the Law of the Sea, and they also invited in Western oil corporations to do things like initial soundings and mappings with which to press their claims, not just with China, but I want to note, with each other. And this is going to be a theme. Geopolitical problems are not just everyone versus China. That's a US view. Everyone has frictions with everyone else, actually, and even in Northeast Asia between South Korea and Japan. Well, China reacted extraordinarily badly and negatively to this move by these smaller countries who really aren't that small, like Malaysia, to say, I'm claiming this and I'm inviting a Western corporation. And that was the start of an uptick of everything you see here. This incident was, right here was 2016. Now this is 2020, so you can see 4 years apart. This is aerial incursion, 2021, June 2021. This was 2014. It led to Vietnamese protests that turned violent and resulted in the Chinese having to temporarily abandon most of their embassy. And I think some Chinese died in the fracas, actually, that resulted in this. This is, again, Malaysia. And now it's not just aerial rights, it's fossil fuel reserves. Although I want to note, with China, again, it goes back to this notion of ending the century of humiliation by reclaiming all lost lands. Of course, you can be Machiavellian about it, right? That area that has fossil fuel, yeah, that was taken to me by a colonial power. So when you write history, you also get minerals along the way. You know, you can fool with history as to where your true borders are. Now, how does the U.S. want to deal with this? Something our students at ACSC often don't realize is they're not just realists focused on military power. A lot of my students say, yeah, I'm a realist. It's all about power and military power and strength. But when we get into it, we realize values lies at the bottom of a lot of their own beliefs. Values that say who is a bad actor and who is a good actor. And actually, European institutions are based not just on so-called quote-unquote hard power, deterrence, compellence coercive diplomacy, but also cooperative institutions to share universal values. And I want to just note, we're studying Russia at ACSC right now. Guess what, and I'll tell you the answer, it's a rhetorical question, but guess what Russia first reacted to before they invaded Ukraine. It was Ukraine trying to sign on to an EU preferred economic agreement, not as a full EU member, but enough of a special trading partner with the EU that economic and social relations would have gone west and away from the traditional Russian imperial center. Russia reacted to that more than Ukraine maybe joining NATO. So the cooperative values part is just as important of our view of the world. And this is where realism and values collide. We look at Malaysia, we look at South Korea, we look at various what's called middle powers, Thailand, Vietnam, Singapore, and we say, hey, who are you with? We got to deter here. We got to balance power. Who are you with? What values do you stand for? I'm about to give you a long presentation and then hopefully 30 minutes of Q&A that says that this is unfortunately not a helpful way fully to look at this complicated region. For instance, institutions are about unending conflicts of interest that are managed, not problems that are solved by joining the right legal institutions and abiding by those institutions like they do in the EU or NATO. You have enduring, time unlimited conflicts of power, identity, and interest in this fragmented region. And middle powers especially, and more this includes South Korea, not just ASEAN powers, want to manage in all directions without being entangled and tied in to one alliance's dictates or one definition of interest, like the US obsession with proliferation with North Korea. The other thing is states, and again, this more and more includes South Korea, not just ASEAN states, but classically ASEAN or Southeast Asian states have said, let's try and manage a balance without undue coercion. And we're still pursuing the same end, effective domestic peace and prosperity without international war and conflict. We share those ends. But the question is how you go about doing it, especially when, and again, I'm just going to make short reference to this, the fact that even the most modern and democratic states are having major tussles right now, not over economics, not over directly military strength, but the direct variable is identity. And I just give you a couple examples here. I don't know how many of you have heard of the comfort women issue, but it's the Japanese military and colonial governor set up a program by which quote-unquote volunteers in the South Korean population who are women would service the male members of the Japanese military and to some degree the colonial civilian officials. As South Korea gets further and further from the Cold War, as the conservatives on the far right of Korea are literally dying out or graying like me, you know, bald like myself, or even older, and as younger generations are coming in, they're getting less and less obsessed with North Korean communism and more obsessed with colonial history of Japan. It's the way and I'll give you a general framework for how to think about national identity, about why this sort of thing happens. The younger the South Korean, the more they're worried about Japanese past and potential future abuses as much as they are the DPRK or China. And so South Korea is starting to mimic what most of my presentation is going to be about, which is the behavior of Southeast Asian middle powers. But this is 2017. If you're a Japanese tourist, that's facing you on a bus possibly in Seoul or Busan. This is 2015, 2016. There was a sovereign agreement between Japanese Conservative Party elites and Korean Conservative Party elites to bury the comfort woman issue once and for all offer a Japanese fund for reparations to families and those still living, and to involve Abe doing the requisite bow and apologizing for all time. Well, the problem is, and don't have time to go into this, but if you're interested, I can send you separate slides on Japan that answers the question why. But Japan, at the same time it was doing this agreement, for the prior decade or 15 years was changing textbooks to water down statements about the comfort women in Japanese high schools. At the same time, Japanese prime ministers in the previous decade to this agreement were visiting something called the Yasukuni Shrine, where not only are all the spirits of the war dead buried and many bones of dead soldiers, but since 1978, the souls of 16 Class A war criminals, and when I say war criminals, I mean the MacArthur trials, were reinterred at Yasukuni. And so when a Japanese prime minister visits Yasukuni on a certain Memorial Day, they're visiting not just all the normal soldiers, but the souls of these 16 people that we classified as war criminals. And this is what leads into the reimposition of the statue. The agreement got rid of a comfort woman statue at a consulate in Busan. And then the these are youth protecting the comfort woman statue. They've even put a hat on it because it's cold out. And these are South Korean police making sure that nothing goes south. And eventually, a more left-leaning government gets in. When I say left, I mean nationalist, less focused on the alliance than on South Korean autonomy and sovereignty. And this statue was reinstalled, and there's a statue in Seoul as well. And if you go to Berlin, you can visit a comfort woman statue in Berlin that youth NGOs have funded and put there. And the Germans have resisted Japanese efforts to get rid of the one in Berlin. So that just gives you a small taste of, hey, our vision of security is you're democratic, you're capitalist, you're like the Europeans, you're getting along with each other. You're like France and Germany and Denmark. You're all, common currency, common values. Not the case in East Asia among our democratic capitalist allies increasingly. Now, this raises the question of how to look at the region, and I would argue that we need to start accepting that whatever the regime type and whatever their economy, that most of world history has been defined by multipolarity. And these are different books on multipolar systems, but that's where even states with similar values can compete in some areas, and alliances may not be 100% just one group is on one side, one group on the other. In my way of understanding divisions in East Asia, both Northeast and Southeast, and also I'm writing a book on Taiwanese identity versus China now, and vice versa. My way of understanding it is looking back at the what's called the European age of nationalism, when ethno-nationalist identity really rose up in a populist way in Europe and influenced even what monarchs and autocrats were doing in Europe going into World War I. And 1914 is not an accident. Scholars who focus on state development and especially evolution and national identity say that this was a very poisonous period, and you can't understand 4 years of trench warfare that killed over 10 million people in mud and muck of trench warfare fighting without understanding that the state is not just all this nice sort of Lockean Western Enlightenment stuff, but modern the idea of an exclusive ethnic nation almost inevitably seems to be connected to the modernizing enterprise. And so France is a modern nation state. It's also French. Denmark is a modern nation state. It's also Danish, and so on and so on. Now, where this gets especially interesting, and you could raise this about our country as well, but let me point to Southeast Asia. What makes this especially interesting is when you have a polyglot state, when you have many competing ethno-religious or sectarian identities, and elites at the top have to figure out how to develop and prosper in the middle of division. But just so you know, this is sort of the European Enlightenment view, cosmopolitan, universalist. This is the view of the European Union. Or if you join NATO, this is sort of your view. But a lot of the world is still defined by internal conflicts on the right side of the slide. So elites are desperately trying to make everyone feel equal, even though capitalism is very much making people unequal. And by the way, throughout Asia, this applies to Japan, South Korea even more so, Southeast Asia especially, even China, suffering from major inequality in the middle of the current global capitalist development surge in the region, major inequalities. And I'm sorry, there's red text you can't see there, but I'll just fill this in. You have leaders who just partially represent maybe one or two ethnicities within their polyglot citizenry, or maybe they're elite economically, or maybe they're an elite regionally. They come from the right region as opposed to the poorer region, etc. Then you've got all this deep culture. Like if Washington disappeared tomorrow, I'd still be a North Dakotan in identity because I grew up on a farm in North Dakota, right? That's this deep level. There's a certain way that pancakes are made that my mom made that's just the right way to make pancakes. That's like deep core culture, okay? But then you got leaders trying to build this fuzzy thing in the middle, and for those who can't see it, that's a question mark. And this red says the nation. Nations are imagined creations. There was no such thing as a civic political nation, say the nation of France, before France spent hundreds of years and lots of warfare internally and externally to create that nation. Our own Civil War was a war not just over slavery, but over values that defined our version of America as a nation, not just a state or a government, but a common culture and values. So nations are created, oftentimes through a great deal of inequality and conflict, and oftentimes involving one ethnicity repressing or having more rights than another. It's not an easy, harmonious process. And just to mention a European example, there was a time that being Protestant in France, if you're a Huguenot, you can look that up. If you were a Protestant in a part of France, then you were probably being ethnically cleansed for religious reasons, just to give one small example from European history. So despite economic interdependence, and I just want to focus here on this, it's not just finance and trade. Anything that's made today, like this clicker, probably went through at least 2 countries, right? Designed in one country, parts made in another, like the plastic, assembled in another country, shipped by a global shipping company. Despite all that, there is simply a lack of civic nationalist commonality throughout East Asia. And so territory is very important, not just in security terms of geography, the geography of basing and modern weaponry ranges, but also nationalist terms of identity. That's our territory for this reason. And so let's go to Southeast Asia as an example of this framework. And I just want to say again, this framework I just showed you for looking at the evolution of nation states, I'm applying this general framework to every part of East Asia right now. I'm applying it to Japan, South Korea dispute, to the Taiwan-China dispute, as well as Southeast Asia. So if you want what I've been writing for conferences on Taiwan-China with this framework, or South Korea disputes with Japan, just the slide at the start of the pack has my email me, let me know, I'll send you a conference paper which looks more northeast. But I'm going to spend time now down here. And there's, of course, the ubiquitous or infamous 9-dash line, which isn't on this map, but goes very close to Scarborough Shoals, Spratlys, cleaves very close to Malaysian Borneo, Sarawak and Sabah provinces is this part of Malaysia. And please note, Malaysia is over here, and Malaysia is way over here. I still have trouble grasping that as an American, right? Because as a North Dakotan, I can jump in a car and I can drive all the way to Texas, although I wouldn't want to do that because I'm an upper Midwesterner. Sorry, anyone in Texas, it's not. You know, I can get in a car in California and God help me drive all the way to North Carolina or to New York, even though I'll be dead by the end of it. But if you're Malaysian, not only you're divided by all this water, but you've got untold amounts of little islets that define your territory out here that this map just can't show. Same with Indonesia. Indonesia is look how spread out. And Indonesia is spread out over an area roughly the size of all of Western Europe. And then Singapore is at the tip of one half of Malaysia, and Malaysia separates Singapore from Thailand. And you can just look at the dense geography up here. And by the way, China is trying through Belt and Road to connect all major cities up here down through all the way to Singapore, connecting Vietnam to Laos to Cambodia to Thailand to Myanmar, and all of them down to Malaysia and Singapore. I'll get to an example of how, because of fragmented interests, it's not just us who has difficulties getting stuff done in this environment, it's also China. You'll be happy to find out. But first, just the general picture. The general picture is fragmentation in the presence of economic interdependence. Geopolitical and identity-based fragmentation despite economic interdependence. And so there's different geography facing you, there's different imagined histories, there's differing levels of domestic fragility. And I just want to say that except for tiny Singapore, all these countries in Southeast Asia are suffering in one way or another pretty mightily from development problems. Malaysia is doing pretty well. They're still viewed as a middle country economy. Indonesia is still viewed as very underdeveloped in comparison. But even Malaysia is not viewed as completely first world developed over their whole territory. Thailand seems to, a lot of these countries have reached a peak of their development where state-guided and state-aided capitalism, not unlike China's, has kind of hit a ceiling, and the political forces, they're sort of stagnating socio-politically and socio-economically. And so development is still an ongoing concern in these countries. And so domestic fragility is driving most elites in most of these states. If you're Singapore, you're worried about anyone ganging up on you because you have no strategic depth. But you get beyond Singapore, and this region is defined in one way or another by great levels of internal fragility and uncertainty that drives what elites think and do externally. So let me just give you a taste of that. I meant to say lots of ocean, not lots of water, because water can be a resource, right? This should say lots of ocean between them and China. In Malaysia and Indonesia, they're very focused on managing a polyglot demography. They're less concerned about direct Chinese military threats and often are very critical of the U.S. over-militarizing disputes. And they're two leading states that created ASEAN in the late 60s and have defined ASEAN norms of consensus that I'll be getting to in the course of the slideshow. These are semi-democratic regimes, I should say. Not only are they defined by being an archipelago with a large distance between them and big bad China geographically, they're also at least semi-democratic. But these states, and you may be surprised to see Thailand there because we cooperate on the M, but I'll just tell you, we have been shunning Thailand on the D, I, and E and dime purposely since about the mid-aughts, or I should say the late aughts. Why? Because one military/royalist regime after another has used the Constitutional Court and its connections to the Constitutional Court to amend election laws while elections are going on to get the right result. You know, all this counting isn't going the way we like. Constitutional Court, we need to change the counting rule. Can we do that, please? That's happened several times. There have been clashes in the street between what's called the yellow shirts and the red shirts. The yellow shirts, the yellow is the Thai royalty. And so there's this imagined identity in Thailand of the Chakri dynasty. They imagine going back centuries of pure blood. So the royalty is huge in Thailand for a good part of the population. Here's the thing, it was actually a series of military coups and military governments in the early post-colonial period in the 50s who really played up the royalty, and people were educated into, in other words, this is part of the new Thai nation. They say it's immemorial, but actually the royalty being as huge as they are in Thai politics as a non-democratic institution is actually relatively recent. It's sort of an imagined history. But a lot of people who wear yellow will go out in the streets and protest against the Reds. Who are the Reds? The red shirts came into being when a globalized Chinese ethnic Thai, a Han ethnic Thai magnate who made a lot in the IT sector. Think of Bill Gates for Thailand or Jeff Bezos for Thailand. Prime Minister Thaksin. And he was populist. He came from a poor northern area that was less represented in Bangkok in royal court and military politics or in the parliament. And like most populists, he upset the apple cart a lot and frightened those in power by saying we should enlarge the middle class to include poor villagers who are now moving to the city and funding their kids to go to college to find better jobs, not this static idea of a middle class in Bangkok just tied to the court and to this existing order from the 50s. And so you get they're not just identity disputes, they're economic disputes. Thailand is rated the most unequal country in the world by some rankings today, which is quite a feat because there's a lot of inequality in the world. And in the face of this contention between red shirts and yellow shirts, and you can just Google red shirts, yellow shirts, you can have days of reading on that. But there's been so many ugly protests, so much turbulence, that the military with the royalty have just basically rewritten the Constitution serially 2 or 3 times to ensure the desired election results. So most Thai experts basically say they have democratic elections, but when 250 of your parliamentarians are appointed by the military, probably you're not a democracy anymore. So that's why I group them that way. Of course, you have more impoverished states. Indonesia has out of control illicit logging. Some of the worst eco damage in the world is happening in Indonesia right now. Palm oil plantations, illegal timber industry that sends wood into the Chinese factories. And of course, Cambodia and Myanmar have hugely conflictual history. Right now in Myanmar, for the last at least decade, right, there have been major human rights crimes in Myanmar against the Rohingya, an ethnic minority. You've got those that have the unfortunate status of being picked on the most by Beijing, although remember my slide of newspaper clippings that's slowly changing? If you're Vietnam and Philippines right now, you're very happy every time China pokes Malaysia and Indonesia in the eye. Because something you'll get by the end of the lecture is Malaysia and Indonesia are most committed to this consensus of reciprocity and avoiding conflict in ASEAN. Vietnam and Philippines have been feeling the heat from Beijing for a couple decades now, increasingly. And especially, the Paracels are very close to Hainan Island. I'm not surprised China wants rights to close to Hainan Island. That's where their subs are. And Philippines, of course, you've probably seen news articles, Scarborough Shoal, Spratly Islands, disputes over China has paramilitary fishermen, believe it or not, that are supplied, modern boats supplied by the state, and they'll go and tussle with the Coast Guard of another state that's trying to enforce their version of economic zone. And then lo and behold, the Chinese Coast Guard will sail in and attack the defending Coast Guard, so the Chinese fishermen get away scot-free or can continue fishing, if that makes sense. So there's been these Coast Guard tussles and naval scuffles and fishermen scuffles most intensely between these states, but now it's spreading out to the rest of the Nine-Dash Line to include increasingly Malaysia and Indonesia, who until recently have tried to stay aloof. So to get at this point of fragmentation, ASEAN meetings for a long time were fragmented between states who wanted to take a hard line on Beijing and states who were just like, let's avoid non-controversial language in our statement. And that's been a division at least until recently. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that these states have disputes with each other. This is just one of many examples. A Singapore officer is always teaching over at ACSC. And over the last couple of years when I talk to them, they say, yeah, nationalism has been rising up in Malaysia in response to China. But guess what? When nationalism rises up in Malaysia, we suffer too. Because suddenly Singapore, who's trying to reclaim ocean to get more strategic depth, to get more land in the face of climate change, right? They run into claims of Malaysia that, no, you're claiming ocean you shouldn't as part of Singapore. They've had fights over military exercise rights in ocean and in sea lanes. And then finally, to look at another one that's in the news, in the regional news a lot, it's not just us for which immigration is a third rail of politics. It turns out that poor Indonesia has a lot of emigres going to richer Malaysia. Richer Malaysia, there have been little crises in relations, like a maid, an Indonesia native maid was made to stay in a doghouse by their Malaysian household master or client, and then the dog would kill them, and then it would blow up in the Indonesian press. That was a couple years ago. And so this gives you a smattering of ideas. So how do you deal, if you're a middle power in ASEAN, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with the fact that America can be very inconstant over decades or over years? How do you deal with the fact that China's cooperative one year, but the next year, oh, hello, there's a Chinese Coast Guard cutter harassing our fishermen? How do you deal with that? And their answer has not been democratic capitalism as we define it, but to harden the sovereign state. And there's a bevy of Southeast Asian scholars, from the region, writing in English, who have basically said that these states' interests are in making conditional and limited alignments. Conditional on the great power respecting their bottom line, and limited in time and duration and purpose, i.e. not NATO, not the U.S. alliance with South Korea or the U.S. alliance with Japan. And the purpose is to avoid getting entangled in any one great power's definition of interests, as well as avoiding getting totally abandoned. And this is on a slide near the end, but I'll just mention that presidents come and go in the U.S., right? President Trump had a way of saying America first pretty loudly and pretty often. Southeast Asia heard. And whatever the intent of the administration, what they heard is, can we trust that the U.S. is going to be there through thick and thin if it's America first? And I'm not saying Trump is right or wrong. I'm saying this is how it was perceived. And so it played into this Southeast Asian idea of we need more autonomy. And I said I'd throw in South Korea whenever I could. Did anyone catch what just happened with the South Korean military? I think it was yesterday or a couple days ago. May have been even a week ago. They tested their biggest conventionally armed missile to date, their longest range, most precise missile. And in fact, a couple months ago, I believe it was, South Korea tested a submarine launched, here so far, conventionally armed missile. That's a signal. That's a signal. Maybe we have to rely on ourselves. So how do you manage indefinitely a balance of power and interests? And there's this whole bevy of dense alpha, it's called derisively by Americans the alphabet soup of ASEAN. These are all ASEAN connected. You had a huge financial crisis that gutted countries like Indonesia and South Korea and a good part of Southeast Asia in 97, 98. It doesn't get enough press over here or enough teaching, the 97, 98 crisis. But it was a liquidity crisis. There was a run on currencies of poorer economies. And so the ASEAN Plus 3 has created various currency exchange mechanisms. There's a future currency crisis where speculators sell all the Thai baht or sell all of a country's currency, and a country is literally going bankrupt from lack of currency, that these big guys in Northeast Asia, the more developed countries, will step in and lend currency. And that's what started ASEAN 3. Defense ministers meeting, very important symbolically, representing the M. I want to underline here human security issues. The ARF was started in '94, and it was originally started to, the America hoped that they would address hard security and territorial issues, like the real, deterrence, China grabbing stuff. That's what the ARF should discuss, bad guys grabbing stuff. Instead, as per ASEAN norms, focused on less contentious issues that everyone could agree on. Illicit trafficking. By the way, I was at a Sri Lanka conference in 2018, my first time with a diplomatic passport, which was a nightmare to get. I don't recommend it. But I was representing the Air Force, and at the conference, this is what I saw. Australian, Sri Lankan, ASEAN country, and even East African military officers talking about illicit fishing and how the fish diet was endangered the fish were endangered of extinction within 20, 30 years or less if we don't get a handle on illicit fishing. So this is another thing I want to kind of burn into your consciousness. How do you define the term security, quote unquote? We define it by we need to deter China from grabbing territory or shutting down sea lanes or invading Taiwan. But for a lot of Asians, what I saw at Sri Lanka is, yes, that stuff matters, but don't forget we need to eat too. And we've got a problem with illicit trafficking. And then finally, another pattern I want to kind of leave you with is we view institutions as cooperative exercises that if you join, you're joining a developed democratic club, committed to certain things like free press, individual rights, and so on, like the EU or NATO accession has human rights and Civ Mil standards that you have to meet. In East Asia, institutions, why are there so many of them with so many different memberships? It's because institutions themselves are part of this subtle balance of power. Namely, Indonesia and Malaysia tried to form a community of Asia for Asians, and stressed China. This is before China was getting in their face, right, in the last decade or so. They wanted to create a more Asian-focused community of security. Japan spoke up and said, well, we're an Asian power and we want Australia and America in. And then Singapore, more quietly in a whisper, we want America and Australia and India to be there. And lo and behold, now everyone's in the East Asia community. But what this shows is that the formation of cooperative institutions is itself a contested part of the balance of interests and power in East Asia. So what is ASEAN's true purpose if it's not focused on coercive deterrent threats as its first, raison d'etre, its main reason for being. As I said, managing competition in a very fragmented region. But most of all, protect sovereign autonomy. Especially in Southeast Asia, most elites could be described as oligarchic in some way. They represent a section of the polity. Like in Malaysia, there are parties that represent the minority Chinese and Indian professionals who have less power than the Malay Muslims, who have proportionally less wealth but have been held up constitutionally as representing the true identity of Malaysia. And the way that you avoid conflict domestically in Malaysia is you have ethnic elites bargaining with each other. Ideally, this is being tested right now, by the way, in the midst of globalization. But classically, you had oligarchic elites speaking for their ethno-religious bloc, bargaining with each other behind closed doors. That's what I meant by semi-democratic. Even democratic states in Southeast Asia are more semi-democratic by Western standards. But here's an external focus of ASEAN. And I got this from research interviews of American experts on Southeast Asia, and they said, listen, I'm going to tell you something in this non-attribution interview that no Southeast Asian wants to say out loud, which is, we fear and trust all major powers in equal measure. In other words, we don't particularly trust any of you. Going back to colonialism, Dutch colonialism, British colonialism, again, I mentioned America being perceived as inconstant in interests, certainly China. And so he said that since I'm an American who specializes in Southeast Asia, I'll just say the bald truth, which is they use ASEAN to tame and socialize us big bad powers that may squash, run in and wreck up the Pottery Barn. And so they don't want any great power to ally with any other, but they do want all great powers to get along and not upset the apple cart of sovereign development. And so a major focus is on non-interference. Do not interfere in my domestic affairs. And it's neither balancing or bandwagoning, and what I mean by that is no country wants to say, I'm 100% with China. No country wants to say, I'm 100% with America, or for that matter, India, Japan, etc. Instead, let's focus on mediation, consensus building, conflict management. And I've already mentioned this, non-coercion. Hopefully, multilateralism provides a cover for quiet and respectful bilateral relations, diplomacy and understandings. And I want to emphasize that this is all very subtle and symbolic. What do I mean by subtle and symbolic? Many of you probably are aware that Duterte has been a bit of a wild card. That Duterte, 1 minute seemed to be close to the US, but the next minute is in Beijing saying, no, I don't want any US bases, and moreover, let's have kind of a strategic development partnership. Well, here's what Asians understand, but we get apoplectic when we see that and think, oh my God, the game's over. Philippines are in bed with the Chinese, right? That's our response. Here's what Asians understand. At the same time Duterte is in Beijing, a part of his government is getting recon jets from Japan, which is China's main ideological enemy right now in identity terms. All nations are managing dime relations, including security and capacity building relations in all directions. Japan has been a major help to all of them in supplying Coast Guard cutters, training equipment, equipping, and especially training in Japan itself. And I just want to emphasize, not all the nations, the weakest ones like Cambodia and Myanmar tend not to shut off the tap on China. They're too tied in their development to Chinese aid. But if you're more of a middle power, like this list here, any given year, you are juggling multidimensionally all these ties, and you may at any moment say, China, you're getting too big for your britches. You know that financial loan and this Malaysia is an example of this, where they push back. Yeah, we're rewriting the terms of that loan. That loan is off. Let's renegotiate. Manufacturing deals. Vietnam, I've had Vietnamese students tell me we got tired of them shipping in Chinese workers and relabeling signs, local public signs like stop signs and so forth, street signs, in their version of Mandarin, and we started to push back on what we felt they were creating, kind of like colonial zones, manufacturing zones of Vietnam, and we're pushing back. Infrastructure deals are stalled in Thailand. And weapon systems, if you're Indonesia, you probably have a weapon system from India, US, China, Japan. You kind of get the picture. The balance of power is subtle and symbolic, not exactly like America sees the balance of power, which is we've got a B-52 flying close to Russia armed with nuclear weapons for nuclear deterrence. And there's all these other powers you can do deals with, right, that you can quote unquote balance. And here's a good example. Why do I hold up Thailand? I personally felt analytically, when I read about, it was probably I wouldn't call it a military coup, the third constitutional rewrite by the Thai military in 2017. And there were some armed coups in the decade leading up to that as well in response to election results. When I read that, as an American, I thought, the jig is up. Thailand is going all China. They are getting so authoritarian, they are gutting democracy so much. Our relations with them beyond our military exercises are so bad that they're going to be in China's court because one autocratic leader is going to line up with another autocratic leadership, right? Well, not so fast. Fragmented region, fragmented interest. Sovereign autonomy. Thailand is rather proud of their identity they've built up around the Chakri dynasty. They're rather proud of their royalty and their autonomy. And so, surprise, Bangkok's indifference to Beijing's plan creates gap in Belt and Road Network. Remember the earlier map. China has to go through Thailand to get to part of Malaysia. It has to go through Malaysia to get to Singapore, which then opens up. They're right next door to Malacca Strait at that point, right? At least by rail, high-speed rail ties. Well, you can look this is in Nikkei Asian Review, Nikkei, if any of you want to look it up later. It's a very recent story. One reason I'm using it. Essentially, China wants to get where China wants to get with its high-speed rail lines, to connect everyone to everyone and everyone to China. Bangkok has decided China's not funding enough of it because Bangkok wants to run east-west rail lines. It doesn't want another north-south rail line necessarily. It doesn't see the interest. So they inked a deal, but now they're stalling. And it just perpetually seems stalled. And that's how politics looks in this region is you'll ink a deal, and then in implementation, there's pushback and back and forth depending on the needs of the moment in domestic politics. So basically, these countries, more than America, I think, know how to use the dime in very subtle ways to create a symbolic balance of interests. And a lot of it has to do with this. Rather than NATO's getting the F-35, it's more like, without it being in Malaysian press, we're cooperating at sea with Malaysia on a maritime domain awareness bilateral exercise, that sort of thing. Or the air equivalent. And I view it as network ties. Let me give you another example. Singapore is a multi-ethnic state by constitution. They're kind of semi-democratic. The reason they're kind of semi-democratic is their elite are basically Han Chinese, or at least until recently. They're debating whether they can start making the leadership a bit more polyglot. But essentially, Singapore is an example of a successful multi-ethnic state, but managed by sort of a hegemonic ethnicity, the Han Chinese. Singapore, when they founded themselves, I believe it was 1965, had a dilemma. They wanted relations with China, but they didn't want China to colonize them as fellow Chinese. At that time, Mao was in power. At the same time, they didn't want all their ASEAN neighbors to say, aha, we knew it, you recognize mainland China, you're just a puppet of Beijing because you have ethnic Han running the country. Lee Kuan Yew, the leader who started Singapore, he's just a Chinese puppet. So they do this dance where they don't recognize the mainland until very late in the game, until nearly everyone else in ASEAN had recognized the post-Deng Xiaoping government. But up until that point, they appeased China by saying, well, we're non-communist, we're not anti-communist. So this just gives you an idea of how subtle diplomacy can be in the region. I don't have time to go. I've actually given you a lot of Malaysia, so I'm going to burn through hopefully you guys can get the slide pack. I have the Malaysia example here. Let me just say with the Malaysian example that this is an example of pushback. Malaysia until after 2010, Malaysia was we would interpret it as anti-Western, to the point where Al Gore and George Bush had something in common. They both showed up at an ASEAN meeting and browbeat Malaysia for abetting corruption and being anti-free market. You never thought Al Gore and George W. Bush had something in common. They did. They both bashed Malaysia. And by the way, bad diplomacy in this setting, they did it publicly at an ASEAN meeting, and that is not the purpose of public multilateral ASEAN meetings. That's something you do bilaterally or behind closed doors. But we're brash Americans, right? So Malaysia was very pro-China, but then China uses corruption very well, you may have heard. And so they get into bed with a particular leader, and the one MDB fund, you can look it up as a scandal. Our own Treasury Department sanctioned Malaysia's development fund as basically a big slush fund for oligarchic elites. Turns out the Treasury Department was right, because in 2018, the favored Malay nationalists got together with minorities and made a strange bedfellows coalition domestically. Once they got in, they renegotiated everything with China, like really gave China the strong arm, not militarily, but first of all, but actually economically. Then a resurgence in quiet exercises with us. But I want to emphasize, once China was pushed back and sovereign autonomy was regained, the coalition fell apart, perhaps predictably, by 2020. And now we're back to certain parts of the Malaysian polity being relatively disenfranchised because they're not Malay Muslim. So you can see how domestic politics and external politics are combined, and also how semi-democracy can be part of the balance of power in domestic politics. All this said, remember I said that two of the biggest founding members, two of the most important founding members of ASEAN, the others being Singapore, Thailand, and Philippines, don't exactly like U.S. over-militarization of disputes. These are very recent articles, October 19, 2021, October 18th, 2021. You can read this. This subtitle is, Australia's plan to acquire nuclear-powered submarines could start arms race. Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur reiterate. By ASEAN norms, you do not want an arms race where, again, people have to start picking sides where they get entangled in one hard security network or another. I want to point to divisions within ASEAN again. Notice who's making this statement. The two that I characterized as being archipelago, I can't say the adjective, the archipelago nations, who have a lot of ocean generally between them and China, despite all these air and sea disputes over fisheries and the 9-dash line. These nations have a relative amount of physical security compared to Vietnam. And I don't know if you knew this, but Vietnam was invaded by China in 1979, and there was such an limited but attritional war that it's estimated that tens of thousands of Vietnamese and Chinese died as China, feeling surrounded by the Soviet Union to the north and their ally Vietnam to the south. And so in 1979, they basically, Deng Xiaoping in a cowboy hat, his first visit to America, apparently behind closed doors, told our president, this was, must have been President Carter, yeah, we're about to start a war of Vietnam, but don't worry, we're not out to conquer the whole country. We're just teaching Vietnam a lesson and giving Russia a black eye. And because we hated Russia at the time, apparently Carter was like, okay, just don't go too all out in this. So if you're Vietnam, you're looking over your shoulder, right? Because another land invasion could theoretically happen again. If you're Indonesia and Malaysia, you're a little less concerned. And more to the point, you're not part of this Australian obsession with democratic capitalism in the Commonwealth. Australia is doing this not just because they feel militarily insecure. Australia has journalists of dual citizenship that are sitting in Chinese prisons right now. Australia has parties who have been offered money under the table to affect elections by Chinese party interlocutors. Australia media has been penetrated by Chinese money. Well, Australia is part of this Western Enlightenment democratic capitalist view, right? And so these strike at the heart of Australian values. They react in a very Western way. We're going to show our values by buying subs from you and canceling the deal with France. This makes a good part of, not all of ASEAN, but certain states in ASEAN nervous. Notice, though, that Vietnam and Singapore, who are relatively more insecure, did not say anything. So in conclusion, we have some choices. Do we forget our values when we're dealing with a country like Thailand? Should we continue to critique regimes like Thailand's, or like Al Gore and George Bush did, whenever major corruption happens, have our Treasury Department sanction, the government of Malaysia for major, gigantic corruption? Or do we kind of stuff our values away and just pursue a value-neutral approach to foreign policy? This is a big question. An even bigger question is, regardless of what you do towards autocratic regimes in Southeast Asia, how the hell do you extend power in this geopolitical setting? I just described a reality to you where Malaysia will never create a base like Okinawa or like the main island bases throughout Japan. They will not create a Camp Humphreys. That's taking sides. That's poking Beijing directly in the eye. You have omnidirectional network ties. You don't want to take a side. So how do we project power? By the way, that has not been answered. At ACSC, our Commandant is very keen on us studying agile, the agile combat power or something. I'll just tell you that I'm kind of cynical from a geopolitical perspective. I think we may just have to live with the fact that we're never going to get beyond South Korean and Japanese bases for fighter aircraft, frankly. But there is things we can do. The fact is, even wealthier middle powers, even when you get beyond Myanmar and Cambodia, which are more the way underdeveloped end of things, even when you get to relatively wealthier middle powers, they have a lot of trouble protecting their exclusion zone. And Malaysia has said, this is in 2014 in response to Chinese incursions very close to Malaysia's islands and atolls in one area. They stepped up in 2015 patrols by their Coast Guard from 269 to 345 days of the year, looking to boost Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency's assets. We're focused on buying the next super carrier. We're focused on the F-35, the B-21. Are we completely focusing on the right things for this region? or should we take a page from Japan's book and do, the Navy is doing multi-awareness missions, but what about Coast Guards? Should we be funding our Coast Guard to do far more regional engagement like Japan is to help with this problem? And I'll just end with, and I'm not trying to be partisan, this is just a fact that was perceived badly by the region, but at the very least, I always attend the biggest meetings, the ASEAN annual meeting and the East Asia Summit, because in fact, in the past we've jilted them, in the farther past we've not done it, and the most recent example is Trump and Pompeo. This from CNBC, and this was taken from Reuters, which was interviewing actual elites in the region, like politicians and military leaders in the region. And this is the headline. Despite declaring Indo-Pacific, quote, the single most consequential region for America's future, unquote, in a Pentagon strategy report, the Trump administration has steadily scaled back U.S. presence at the East Asia Summit and ASEAN gatherings. To be specific, we sent our Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross to East Asia Summit. I'll just end by saying that's a faux pas, because what's expected is your Minister of State or Minister of Defense or our Secretary of State in our parlance, ideally the President, at least maybe the Vice President, like Al Gore going at one point, or George Bush, the President himself. Instead, we sent the Commerce Secretary. And the article quotes various Southeast Asians themselves, but essentially they were not impressed, and this kind of has upped their worry about U.S. commitment because, and I'll end with this, they don't see Donald Trump did this. They see, can we trust America to be a constant presence vis-a-vis China, or do we have to be very clever and have just relations in all directions? And they use things like the East Asia Summit and the multiple ASEAN gatherings to gauge the seriousness of countries' attendance, to kind of take the temperature, who is really in the region versus who is kind of just playing at being in the region. So with that, I've gone over an hour, apologies, but I'll turn it over to, I'm sure, I hope you have Q&A, but I'll just take off the slide there. And I don't know if the microphones are working, you can probably just stand up and talk, but